Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette 161, where we get philosophy, academic philosophy off the internet, read and review it live on air. This week, because of the state of the United States, we're doing some philosophy of race. So let's see what we got. Philosophy of feminism, gender, race. Philosophy of race. There we go. So let's go find a paper on the philosophy of race. Okay. These are uncategorized things. Maybe I'll, I don't know, let's see if maybe I'll look at a subcategory. Topics, racial identity, racism, politics of, conceptions of. I don't know. Because I looked at some of these first ones already, a bunch of reviews, so. Let's see what else we got. Go down a little bit. Yeah, I looked at this stuff already. Collective choice and social works. See, read this paper. This was actually one of the first papers after all the ones above that I was able to get to. Racial structural solidarity. Whoa, do you hear that or is that me? Oh, I'm getting a rattle. Yeah, I have a fan on my on me now because it keeps getting warm. It's causing the desk to shake, which caused a rattle. Alright, I've got to figure out this setup. Alright, so let's see, what do we got here? Is this available? 13 pages, I like that. I don't like teeny itsy font, but that is good enough for me. So, Roulette has landed on Racial Structural Solidarity by Marin. I always wonder about parents that name their kid almost the same thing as their last name. If you are live in the chat, you can get the paper by clicking on the link there, or you can also type exclamation point paper if you come later, and the link will pop back up if you put that in the chat. So let's download this. Didn't hit the download button before. Clicky. Alright, so. Please do not cite or circulate. Alright, I won't. Swear to God. Yeah, this is a critical review of international social and political philosophy from 2017. Okay, so this will actually be somewhat, won't be contemporary stuff. Alright, no abstract. In the recent primary elections for the Democratic Party nominee of the President of the United States of America, Ta-Nehisi Coates, a journalist for The Atlantic, sparked a debate about the black vote when he criticized Sanders for not supporting reparations. This refusal, Coates thinks, proves Sanders to have a typically class-first, race-blind socialist program that fails to appreciate that addressing issues of minimum wage and poverty does not address issues of white supremacy, such as discrimination in the labor market or under the law. Did someone say, I heard recently basically that the failure of Bernie's campaign is actually also partially behind the unrest at the moment. Someone was saying, look, Bernie was the last hope of a big change in the political process, just doing things as it was. But now when Bernie didn't make it, people gave up on current political reality of having change. So, yeah, so it's an interesting thing. How opinions can change, or at least that one anecdote that I know of. Anyhow, continuing. A number of African American intellectuals have criticized Coates' criticism of Sanders as indicative of an approach that separates racial from class oppression and rests, in the words of Cedric Johnson, on a claim of racial parity within a capitalist market society that leaves untouched the deeper source of inequality and poverty that lie in the overarching process of capitalist accumulation and commodification of human needs. This debate raises the question of anti-racist solidarity. How should we conceive of solidarity for an effective anti-racist politics? I turn to Tommy Shelby's and Robert Gooding Williams' work on black solidarity to tackle this question. I argue that their differences notwithstanding, they share a view of political action that identifies the unity of collective political action with the political purposes deliberately shared by political actors, thus failing to theorize the relationship between political action and the social and material reality it aims to change. This is a shortcoming for an account of solidarity for effective anti-racist politics for two reasons. First, because such an account needs to offer a picture of the changes aimed at by the collective effort. Second, because it needs to offer an account of the sources of the actor's power to effect those changes. We need a structural understanding of race, one that I sketch by extending Iris Young's conception of gender as seriality to race. Oh yeah, my apologies for how I how I say everyone's name, and also that this is not my area, so I apologize if I get things wrong, which I will. But I will try to read it as charitably as possible. Shelby on Black solidarity as common oppression. In an effort to liberate blacks from the burden of racial oppression, black leaders have frequently called on black Americans to become a more unified collective agent for social change. Thus, Tommy Shelby defines the problem of solidarity as that of forging a unified collective agent out of individuals burdened by racial oppression, a collective agent that acts to change the reality of racial oppression. For Shelby, solidarity is about motivation for action. It has to be robust enough to move people to collective action. For Shelby, the question of solidarity is the question of its foundation. There are 5 characteristics necessarily and jointly sufficient for solidarity: identification with the group, special concern for the group's other members, shared values or goals, group loyalty, and mutual trust. He rejects the collective identity theory that holds that blacks who are committed to emancipatory group solidarity must embrace and preserve their distinctive black identity, by arguing that such identity is not necessary for satisfying these conditions and may be self-defeating. In contrast, black solidarity should be based on the shared condition of being victim of anti-black racism, because the common experience of being a victim of anti-black racism provides a sufficient basis for the 5 characteristics of solidarity. What is anti-black racism and who are its victims? For Shelby, racism is an ideology, a set of misleading and irrationally held beliefs and assumptions, such as the belief that blacks are intellectually inferior, that serve to bring about and reinforce structural relations of oppression, and that are socially reproduced through norms that are embedded in the culture. Such irrational beliefs are held because of often unacknowledged fears and desires, such as the white working class fear about unemployment and competition over scarce jobs. Racism, explicit or implicit, continues to be expressed by many. Thus understood, anti-black racism is only one among 3 sources of black disadvantage. The other 2 are 1. The effect of past racial domination, which create disadvantages for some blacks, and 2. Non-racial structural factors that have a negative impact on the life prospects of some blacks. The first of these 2 disadvantages that can be traced to past racial domination are the effect in the present of chattel slavery, land expropriation, segregation, etc. Racial disparities in wealth and education, for instance, can be traced to the history of discrimination, as a result of which generations of black Americans were prevented from accumulating wealth and gaining a formal education. The second, non-racial structural factors, are created by social dynamics that cannot be attributed to racism. For instance, the post-industrial U.S. economy that generally dispenses high rewards to persons with a college education and miserably low wages to those without, stagnation and decline in economic sectors that rely heavily on low-skilled workers, and changes in the tax code that favor individuals and households with significant financial assets. None of these developments rely directly on contemporary expressions of racism to produce their far-reaching social consequences, yet they disproportionately impact blacks in a society where deep racial inequalities in education, employment opportunities, and wealth already exist, and they worsen racial inequality and create new forms of disadvantage. For example, the tax benefits that flow from homeownership are not racist in Shelby's terms, because they are not necessarily designed to discriminate against blacks, but they disproportionately disadvantage blacks because they are less likely to own a home or to own a less expensive home. Yeah, there's a ton of stuff that basically it looks innocent on its own, except it very much supports the people in power to begin with. And so just by being in a place where things were racist in the past, and even though the system is not inherently, the thing itself is not inherently racist by itself, it's like in that sense, in propagating the current structure, then it continues just the racism of the past. Alright, yes, if anyone out there has any questions, please ask. I will try to answer. No guarantees that I know what I'm going to say. In fact, I can tell you right now I don't know what I'm going to say, but I don't know if it's going to be any good either. But I'll try. Among these three sources of black disadvantage, Shelby argues only racism qualifies as the basis of black solidarity because the only one that can unite all black Americans can secure their commitment to fight together, for only the ideology that thinly black persons are inferior affects all black persons. Inferior. What did I say? Say something else. Anyway. Shelby develops this argument by translating the question of solidarity into a Rawlsian-sounding question. What political principles can blacks reasonably expect all other black, because they are black, to commit to as a basis for group action? In determining these principles, that is, principles that blacks can reasonably expect all other blacks to commit to, just in virtue of their being black, Shelby argues that the differences among black Americans can threaten black solidarity. Therefore, support for policies that disproportionately impact black Americans is not a reliable basis for black unity. Black solidarity requires a collective action and around consensus issues, and racism is the only such issue. Yeah, I can see. Well, I mean, this setup is the way the author set this up is you can see they're setting. I can see they're setting the Shelby up for the fall here. So they want, now it turns I want to raise two problems for this view. But yeah, you can see just by the choice of the argument structure and how this is going, you can see that they're going to start attacking very, very soon. All right, so let's see what the attack is now. Our first problem is that it reduces solidarity action to self-interested action. Shelby assumes that the likelihood that some people will defect from those forms of collective action do not advance their interest is a reason to restrict the scope of black politics to those issues that affect the interests of all black people. But if shared interest can motivate us, as Shelby argument assumes, we do not need solidarity, for we can rely on the shared interest to do so. Solidarity, one might have thought, is necessarily precisely where and because of self-interest fails to motivate action. There's something unsatisfying about a view of solidarity that can deliver nothing more than what self-interest can. A second problem, which Robert Gooding Williams and Laurie Balfour have pointed out, is that racism is not a unified phenomenon. Drawing on Kathy Cohen's distinction between consensus and cross-cutting issues of black activism, they have argued that different groups of black people are affected by different sets of stereotypes and different forms of discrimination. Black feminists, among others, have argued that anti-black racism representation of black women as mammy, matriarch, Jezebel, welfare queen, etc. apply specifically to black women. They are intrinsically gendered, not particular instances of generic anti-black stereotypes. Therefore, there is no shared interest in supporting collective action against a putatively generic anti-black racism, as such action will likely only further marginalize the cross-cutting issues that reflect minority interests. Yeah, this is what I was thinking. The setup here is that if you need something so general as to get everyone who counts as black as to be affected by it, it's really going to thin out the whole unifying force of it, because it's just no one's going to have enough of a common experience to begin with if everyone has to have a similar experience. It's going to be too general. So that's what I was thinking. This other, the first problem here is interesting too, because it means that the mark was missed in terms of what it even means to be solidarity even means. So maybe that's okay though. Like maybe Shelby can defend themselves and say, look, you can't guarantee people are really going to have solidarity, so this is really what you need, is to draw on the individual more than the group. Perhaps. I don't know. Okay, so back down to the author. Continuing. If this is right, then we need to revisit the privileged place Shelby gives racism in his understanding of racial disadvantage. Recall that Shelby distinguishes between three sources of black disadvantage and argues that two of them, the effects of past racial discrimination and social dynamics that cannot be attributed to racism, are not properly the object of black politics. Let's take the latter, policies that disproportionately affect black Americans, such as IRS-mandated benefits that flow to home ownership, and accept that they are not motivated by racism, but are created by social dynamics and policies that give advantages to wealth and larger advantages to larger wealth. Yes, this is the rich people benefit stuff. Yeah. I think this is the current state. This is the idea of having the business sort of people in charge. They know how to make more money. So it's like just give the wealthy people more money. It's the trickle-down theory. Shelby argues that although these social dynamics disproportionately affect black Americans, they are not proper targets of anti-racist action because they do not affect all black Americans, but only the poorer ones. This shows, Shelby thinks, that black Americans are disproportionately affected by policies that give advantage to wealth because they are disproportionately among the less wealthy, not because they are black. Such policies should be the target of a different type of politics, a politics that targets wealth inequality, which any black person could join, but not of specifically black politics. Let me analyze this argument through an analogy with policies that disproportionately affect women. On this reasoning, the lack of affordable, good quality childcare that disproportionately affects women is not a proper target of feminist action because it does not affect all women, but only those who are primary childcare providers. This disproportionate impact is due to the fact that women happen to be disproportionately represented among the separately constituted group of primary childcare providers, that is, mothers, not because they are women. Hence, unless motivated by sexism, the lack of childcare facilities is not a proper target of feminist politics. There is indeed a good case to be made that the lack of childcare facilities affects women even when it is not motivated by sexism. It does so in virtue of its intersection with other social practices, processes, and structures, such as the modern organization of work as separate from childcare and the lower value placed on the latter. However, feminists widely agree that the disadvantages flow from the lack of childcare facilities are central to the disadvantages that women experience in virtue of their gender, and thus to the mechanisms that reproduce gender oppression, whether or not sexism has anything to do with it. If sexism has nothing to do with the lack of childcare facilities, then sexism is not a good explanation for these mechanisms. It does not mean that these mechanisms are not gendered in another sense. To insist that sexism alone should be the target of feminist politics because it alone affects all women is to prejudge this question of the best explanation for gender disadvantage to assume what has to be shown. Yeah, I think this is right. Okay. So, Shelby makes a similar mistake in privileging racism as the sole object of black politics. He prejudges the issue of the best explanation of racial disadvantage and the mechanisms that reproduce it. A policy that disproportionately affects black Americans requires an explanation. To say by way of explanation that black Americans are disproportionate among the less wealthy, and therefore the disproportionate effect is not a matter of race, but their wealth level, is to assume that race and wealth level are independent factors. Yeah, I mean, it's just racism in the past. And so it's the way things are now are definitely affected by the way people viewed things in the past. And so you can't separate things that look innocent with the way things work, just because they look innocent now. That may not be how things, sort of like de jure de facto, like how things are in the eyes of the law versus how they are out in the real world. Another example of this stuff that I know a little bit about, and it comes up in philosophy of race, is the discrimination due to like algorithmic things. The modern internet structure has taken basically all of its I did read a book on race. I read the Algorithms of Oppression. I wish I could remember the author's name, but basically the algorithms were developed in terms of library science, and the library science that it was taken from of the past was based on basically it comes from the 1800s, is where library science and the categorization of information was developed. And so they have a lot of racist sort of concepts built into the way information is organized, and that affects things and how different concepts are related and why you think one thing affects another. It's not simply neutral how search engines work. It has taken a lot of information from the history, and therefore even though the search engine says, oh no, we're just presenting the information was racist to begin with. And so this historical structure is still affecting the current contemporary life, because even though the algorithm itself doesn't look it looks neutral, it isn't using neutral, the input wasn't neutral to begin with. Yeah. I got that. I'm in just north of New York City right here. I tried to get because most of the time if I have a more interesting book, it's in New York City Public Library system, not the Westchester Public Library. I got on the waiting list. The waiting list for that book was 40, well, somewhere in the 40s. There was 40 people ahead of me. I checked the Westchester Library system. There was a bunch of copies, and there were 40 people ahead of me. In the Westchester Library system, I think there were 2 copies, and only one of them was checked out. I got it in 2 days. So that was interesting. All right. Anywho, continuing. This explanation is similar to saying that women are disproportionately affected by the lack of childcare facilities only because they are disproportionately among mothers, not because they are women, thus assuming that women and mothers have entirely independent meanings and represent groups constituted through independent social practices. This is an assumption challenged by every feminist analysis of the connections between the social meanings of woman and mother and between the social practices that constitute the two groups. There are such connections that there are such connections does not mean that we cannot conceive of a woman who is not a mother, but that all women are subject to norms that include expectations about their role as mothers. Similarly, racial and wealth disadvantages might very well be connected in the sense that social practices that constitute race are connected to those that structure the creation and accumulation of wealth. There is no reason to assume, as Shelby does, that the two are independent. On the contrary, that black Americans are disproportionately among the less wealthy is a reason to think the opposite, that one's race is connected to one's ability to acquire wealth. Moreover, the connections between the American practices of race and slavery and segregation also suggest a connection given the economic impact of slavery and segregation on one's access to wealth. We need therefore a conception of race that enables us to ask questions about these connections. This is a conception of race that does not reduce race to either the practice of assigning individuals to different racial groups or to the ideological set of beliefs underpinning this practice, but connects it to social and material processes that support and perpetuate it. Okay, so anything else to say about this section? Not really. I think this is right. There is a disanalogy here between women and mothers. There's something definitely historical, but also biological and social about that one. The example that they were using here about wealth generation, definitely I don't think there's anything biological about that. But still, it's a historical and political in terms of how it's connected, and so there still has to be some sort of. I mean, to assume that there wasn't some connection there would just be wrong, first of all, and second, it would be just sort of naive because of the history. Why wouldn't there be a reason? Even instead of the history, why would the world be this way would be a good question. And second, to be ignorant of the history of, of course anyone in this area should know that there is a historical connection between these areas and things. I mean, it's not. Yeah, so good criticism. At least it seems the presentation of it was nice, at least. I don't know if it was fair to the original author, but I'll take this author's word for it. I have not read the background material. But, continuing. Gooding-Williams on non-foundational solidarity. By building on feminist conceptions of intersectionality, Gooding-Williams' argument that different groups of black Americans are affected by different forms of racism might be a more promising point of departure for such a conception of race. As an alternative to Shelby's common oppression view of solidarity, Gooding-Williams suggests a non-foundational idea of solidarity that it's forged in action rather than being based on something that precedes politics. This type of solidarity requires the reinvigoration of black politics. Different publics of black politics. Interesting. Okay. So idea it's forged in action. Interesting concept. Sorry that it forged in action. Okay. This view of black politics is informed by Gooding-Williams' reading of Douglas's Thought in Bondage, according to which Douglas proposes a notion of politics as a practice of action in concert between equals. Politics, on this view, is a practice of freedom based on consent and affiliation, opposed to the kinship ties that slavery denies slaves. In Douglas's thought, the plantation version of this politics is represented by the band of brothers that, having been thrown together on Mr. Freeland's plantation, begin to consult one another to debate and deliberate the merits of different courses of action, thus cultivating ties of loyalty and forming themselves into a band of subversive activists by consenting through their speech, action, and mutual commitments to resist slaveholder tyranny. In this way, they form affiliative relationships with one another, that is, because each has agreed to adapt his own a mutually shaped sense of political purpose. In short, according to Gooding-Williams, Douglas portrays plantation politics as an enterprise of equals driven by a shared and discursive expressed concern to free the world of tyrants and oppressors. Thus understood, politics can and sometimes should be race conscious, but in being so, it need not be antecedently formed in racially specific spiritual or cultural orientation. Gooding-Williams agrees here with Shelby in rejecting the collective identity theory, but unlike Shelby, he thinks the race dimension is created through politics rather than being pre-political. It is created discursively by political actors, produced through processes in which political actors invest with significance the condition of being black in light of their interpretation of what their political purposes demand. Alright, so it's a sort of a self-generation of a category. I mean, it's an interesting way to go about this. You're sort of a self-determination of your own race in that case. What counts as race is a mutually determined thing. And so the question is, where is it grounded then, if it's mutually determined between just some perhaps rather different people? Sounds more like a club. Alright, so this harkens back to Gooding-Williams' earlier distinction between being black and being a black person. Being black is the product of a rule-governed social practice of racial classification, while being a black person is a result of one's interpreting and assigning significance to being black. While one cannot escape being black, it is thrown into the condition of being black by a racist social practice. Being a black person is a matter of self-description, of assigning meaning to that condition. Thus, one becomes a black person only if, 1, begins to identify oneself as black, and 2, one begins to make choices, to formulate plans, to express concerns, etc. in light of one's identification of oneself as black. Gooding-Williams points to Sartre's notion of being a Jew, according to which to be a Jew is to be thrown into a situation of a Jew, as similar to his notion of being black. Explaining the notion of being a black person, he draws on Ian Hacking's notion of dynamic nominalism and his underlying thought that the possibility of human action depend on the possibilities of description, such that if new modes of description come into being, new possibilities of action come into being in consequence. Thus, individuals classified as being as black become black persons just in case they begin to act in the world under the description of themselves as racially black. Yeah, I have had a friend she's a philosopher, went to college with her, although she was already a doctor. She had come in and she eventually did a PhD in philosophy of medicine, so she's probably busy as heck right now. Luciana Sarmento Garbaio, and she said, well, she was Brazilian, so she said she came into this country with she was saying something about this. I did not understand her because of how she understood of being thrown into a society where they understood blackness differently in Brazil than they do here, and so she was trying to explain this to me once, and it was way over my head. But yeah, so there is an issue of being thrown into an identity that you were not expecting, or in some sense. And so she'd start to say, well, I'm looking at myself as these people here in the US. I was like, why would you do that? You have these other things that are going on. You're from Brazil. It's different. But yeah, she was right, I was wrong. This means that there are many ways of being a black person, corresponding to the many and conflicting interpretations of being black, including interpretations that embrace the racial order as just. This diversity is at the heart of Gooding-Williams' view of black politics as the interplay of conflicting purposes with conflicting and likely controversial interpretations of the condition of being black, a non-foundational model of politics that he contrasts to Shelby's. A crucial difference between Shelby's model of politics and his own, Gooding-Williams argues, is that the former conceives of common black interests as given prior to politics as something that political participants pre-commit themselves to, while on his model, common black interests might come out of politics itself as the result of political argument, debate, or collective action. For instance, when the participants tried to persuade each other of one particular interpretation of the condition of being black, including one account of the common interest that the condition entails. Yeah, things definitely do get hashed out in politics, so it's a good point. I don't know how much sense those political arguments make all the time, though. But people do try. While an attractive alternative to Shelby's, this picture of politics as marked by deep disagreement runs into its own problems. First, it is in tension with the action in concert aspect of politics that Gooding-Williams also emphasizes. Douglas's The Band of Brothers acts in concert because they agree to resist slaveholder tyranny. They form affiliated relationships to one another because each has agreed to adopt as his own a mutual shaped sense of political purpose. It is true that these affiliative, consent-based relationships may be formed as part of politics. Consent is expressed through their speech, actions, and mutual commitments. Yet to the degree to which they act in concert, they already share a purpose: to resist slaveholder tyranny. So while there is a non-foundational aspect to their politics, to the degree to which they arrive at common purposes through politics, there is another aspect, the action aspect of their politics that is not. For they act in concert only once these purposes are taken as given. Thus, Douglas's Band of Brothers could not be said to act in concert with those who have fallen prey to the slaveholding priestcraft, to the view that slavery is God's will. Yeah. I'm sure everyone saw Trump walk out in front of the church from a day or two ago. Get a photo shoot. The two groups could engage in debate and argument, each group trying to persuade the other to adopt their interpretation of the condition of being black, but they could not act together. This shows that the acting in concert aspect of politics requires agreement around common purposes, even though politics has a deliberative aspect, one that is marked by deep disagreement. In other words, to the degree to which politics is action, not only debate and argument, Gooding-Williams' view of politics is not crucially different from Shelby's. Those who act together do so based on an agreed upon common purpose. There may be room for disagreement on the details of this purpose and on the means to achieve it, but there is no reason to believe that such disagreement is blocked on Shelby's account. In its action aspect, politics, even for Gooding-Williams, is unified by shared purposes. Acting in concert is acting for shared purposes. Maybe it says, I guess the argument here that the author is presenting is that these two different positions are maybe different only in focus. Like one's focusing on one aspect, another's focusing on a different aspect, and so they're just like prioritizing things differently. But the author is kind of saying they're pretty similar because they both have the background individualist interest sort of backing up their theory. Okay. It is important to note that the act through which these purposes are adopted is fundamentally an individual but not a political one. Okay, so glad I understood something. Adopting particular purposes is part of one's process of becoming a black person, of assigning meaning and significance to the condition of being black. There is nothing essentially political about this act. It could take place in public, it could be spurred by political encounters with other political actors. It could equally take place in private, independently of political encounters. Even when the act is spurred by political engagement, and even if political engagement were necessary to it, politics is still be externally related to it, not a constitutive condition, because for on Gooding-Williams' account of it, it represents the interpretation taken by an individual and over which the individual is more or less sovereign. Yeah. So these are both individualistic theories, I think, is the big criticism here. So where is the solidarity? If this is right, then it sheds more doubts on Gooding-Williams' claim that his view of politics is non-foundational, for there seems to be a non-political act that precedes and that is necessary for political action. Moreover, it also raises difficulty for Gooding-Williams' view of political action, a difficulty for the aspect that makes it action, rather than the aspect that makes it political, as was the case with the first difficulty, in defining the in-concert character of the political action by reference to the shared purposes adopted deliberately. Gooding-Williams' view of politics as action in concert leaves behind the social and material reality that forms the background against which purposes are chosen and pursued in the world. By relying on Hacking's idea that human action depends on description, and suggesting that description is an individual act of meaning-making, of creating something new in the world. Gooding-Williams' view of politics as action in concert obscures the fact that the possibilities of action depend not only on new descriptions, but also on the material and social reality that is already in place, that the possibilities for political action and what makes it effective is not only a matter of the purposes of the actors, but also of the social and material conditions within which action takes place. By making sense of conceptually of the process of becoming a black person on the hacking model and connecting it conceptually to his notion of action in concert, Gooding-Williams throws away and thus erases from our view the feminist character of the condition of being black. Alright, so he's saying he's lost interaction with the world, this being in the world. If you're losing the world there, then you've sort of, you're not grounded anymore, and you're just making stuff up. So saying it's a bit too idealistic is basically this sort of criticism. Too much of what you're just sort of creating in your mind as the idea of being black, but you could just be delusional apparently, and it wouldn't matter on this. The author is kind of saying, because it's not grounded in the world, and so if you're delusional, it would be okay too. And so I guess that's the criticism here, that by losing the thread of like the social and material reality, then you do not get to actually declare being black, because it doesn't make any sense at that point what it is to be black, because you're not tied to the world. Okay. My criticism of Shelby and Gooding-Williams' position in the last two sections suggests that we need a conception of race that would achieve two tasks. First, it would provide an understanding of the social reality of racial disadvantage that would make sense of the unity of racial disadvantage, while also enabling inquiry into its connections to social processes that create disadvantages for groups other than black Americans. By doing this, it would avoid the danger of denying differences on how race and racial disadvantage is experienced by different groups of black Americans. Secondly, it would also provide a notion of action that links political action to social reality of racial disadvantage. In what follows, I argue that Iris Young's concept of seriality can be extended to the concept of race to provide such an understanding of race and racial disadvantage. Okie dokie. Yeah, feel free to ask questions if anyone out there has any. I will try to answer them. Iris Young, 97, borrows Sartre's conception of seriality to articulate an understanding of gender that, she argues, represents an understanding of women as a unified group that does not deny differences among women. Sartre distinguishes between several levels of social collectivity by their complexity and reflexivity. One of the distinctions he makes is that between groups and series. A group is a self-consciously, mutually acknowledged collective with a self-conscious purpose. It is a collection of persons that are united by action they undertake together. Individuals undertake a project together, acknowledge themselves as sharing a set of goals, and as pursuing those goals through their action. Each individual takes on the common project as his or her project. What makes a project shared is a mutual acknowledgement among the members of the group that they are engaged in the project together, which typically becomes explicit in something like a pledge, contract, constitution. The project is collective insofar as the members of the group mutually acknowledge the only or best way to undertake the project is by the group. For both Shelby and Gooding-Williams, political action is action of such groups. Yeah, I think everyone agrees on that one. These self-conscious collectives arise from and often fall back into unself-conscious collectives, which Sartre calls series. At this level of social reality, individuals are united, but not by shared goals and projects. They are united in an impersonal way, through particular constellations of material objects and structures or norms that constrain and enable their actions. What gives the individual in a series unity is the way in which individuals pursue their own individual ends by reference to the same objects and structures that is the result, often unintended, of past actions. Alright, so this is saying the series basically, it's sort of a cultural threads that pull you together. If you're doing stuff according to some sort of constellations of objects and structures, so it'd be like some sort of like social overlap in the way you go about things. Okay. Sartre illustrates the concept of a series with an example of people waiting for a bus. They are united by their relation to an object, the bus, and the social norms and practices that define that object as a bus, that is, the social practice of public transportation. This constellation of objects, social norms, and practices both constrains and enables their actions. Within these constraints, different individuals pursue different goals, aims, and projects. From the point of view of the aims of the people in a series of having nothing in common, they take different actions. However, they are united by their common orientation to the same object and social practices. As part of the series, the individuals waiting for the bus need have nothing in common with their histories, experiences, or identities. Well, they need to have something in common. Well, but yeah. The relation between individuals in a series is impersonal and anonymous. Individuals are fungible. Any individual could take any other individual's place. They do not identify with one another. They do not acknowledge each other as engaged in a shared enterprise. The series is not a group, and its unity is not that of a group. However, the series has the potential to become a group. If the bus fails to show up, those who are waiting for it may complain to one another and may organize themselves to go protest the bus company or to share a taxi. Alright, I think I understand this, but I'm not 100% with start, but I just let it go. I mean, you can imagine like people stuck in an elevator. Like, or people crowding into an elevator. It's very similar to getting on a bus. It's sort of like this mutual transportation thing, but you have to be like super careful about all the group. It's like it forces the group upon you in some sense. I guess that's what maybe is meant by series, but it seems that there might be a little bit more personal in that case, or a bit more unifying. But I understand, like, you can sort of depersonalize group actions. So in part of the unity in this group up here, these groups, what was it, collective? Okay, in the collective, it's like the individual has to submit to the, consciously submit to the being part of the group, but in the series, in some sense, you just are in part of this series to begin with, and so it's less conscious. Alright. The series is what Sartre calls a practical inert reality. It is practical because, like all social relations, is the result of human actions in history. However, the type of action that creates a series is not the self-conscious one. Or to be precise, the aspect under which we look at an action to see what it is about creates a series is not the conscious goal or purpose pursued by the action. Rather, it is the unintended consequence of action and its relation to something external to the agents. The way their actions are constrained by the same norms and objects that are results of past action. Any material objects are experienced as inert because they constrain action and constitute resistance to action. This is why series and being a member of a series are experienced as necessities, constraints often experienced as given and natural. It's sort of like received versus voluntary. You have a received constraints, and that puts you in part of some sort of group, and then the voluntary one is the sort of the choice to become part of a group. So that's sort of alright. More generally, on Sartre's view, any human action takes place against the background of the material things and collective habits, practices, rules, etc. that are the result of past human action oriented toward practical inert objects in a series. Background he calls the milieu of action. Human action structured in this way, oriented towards and constrained by objects, and structured by practices, habits, and rules that are already given, generate, and continuously reproduce serial collectives. Gender, Iris Young argues, should be understood as such a series. What recommends this understanding for her is that it makes sense of the idea that women form a social unity without casting that unity in terms of common attributes or essential features, which erases differences among women. In addition, I would argue, Sartre's conception of human action is structured by practical inert realities explain why social practices like gender and race are both resistant to change, because reproducing themselves through action in the series, and can be changed because they are products of action. Gender is a structural relation to material objects as they have been produced and organized by prior history. But like class and unlike bus rider, gender is a complex, vast, overlapping set of structures and objects. What are these objects and the structures that organize them? Female bodies are among the objects in the gender series. Female bodies should be understood as social objects, not simply as material objects. It is not simply the physical attributes of breast, vagina, clitorises, hormones, and so on, or the physical processes of menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, or lactation that constitute female bodies. Rather, these are constituted by the rules that structure these physical processes, and by the objects, physical spaces, institutions, and practices that result from past human action taking place against this background of social objects and structures. This makes the female body a rule-bound body defined by particular meanings and possibilities. Clothes are also objects in the series, gender as are cosmetics, tools, and the physical separation between the male and female spaces. Young writes, I may discover myself as a woman by being on the wrong dorm floor. In addition to social objects, the series gender is constituted by structures that organize these objects. Young discusses two of these, enforced heterosexuality and the sexual division of labor, which can themselves create a multitude of objects and spaces that further reproduce the series. When they act, men and women take this background into account, even if not in a conscious manner. Self-conscious groups can arise from the social reality of gender. Not all of these groups, however, are feminist groups. Young gives an example from Meredith Tax's Rivington Street, a group of Russian Jewish immigrant women who organized a boycott of the local merchant who has manipulated the chicken market to increase his profits. This group arises from the women's serialized existence defined by the sexual division of labor. It also arises from their serialized existence as shoppers as Russian Jewish working-class immigrants, but it is not a feminist group. Feminist groups, Young proposes, are groups who at least implicitly refer to the series of women. They draw on the experience of living within the series of gender, which is multi-layered and has a wide variety of aspects. Different feminist groups take up different aspects or parts of the series of gender, which explain the diversity of feminism. At the same time, what makes them all feminist groups is that they refer to the series itself. Groups of women, feminist and not, will always be partial in relation to the series, because when women come together as groups, their womanliness is not the only thing that brings them together. Okay. 4. Race as seriality. Like gender, race, I would suggest, is a series. In saying this, I claim there is a unity to race, but this unity is not constituted by shared black culture, a shared set of interests, for example, on Shelby's interest against racial ideology, or shared features intrinsic to individuals. Rather, the unity of race is constituted by a social practice. However, the series race cannot be reduced to Gooding-Williams' social practice of classification of persons into black or white. In addition, it encompasses material objects, the rules that structure them, and the institutions and spaces and practices developed through the actions oriented towards these objects and structured by these rules. Within the series race, there is a distinction between black or raced and white persons, which is not determined by intrinsic qualities of persons, but by the shared constellation of objects, rules, and practices that give different orientations to black and white bodies. But while the series performs this distinction, the series is nevertheless shared by all social actors that inhabit it, regardless of the racial position the series assigns to them. It is shared in the sense that the series structures the actions of both black and white persons. The series race is part of the background for the action of both black and white persons. This is interesting. It's starting to make me think it's a little Aristotelian in sort of its classification. You've got the form and you've got the matter, and in this case the matter is a little not like physical matter, but the matter of the social context and the matter of the in the gender it was like the biological things, but in this sort of race seriality, you've got the matter is the social realities and the and also the biological, like the black versus white, just pigmentation. But so we've got institution, space, practice developed through these. So we've got the form that which counts as the understanding of what being black or white is, but then you've also got the matter, which constrains that form too. Okay, what are the objects and structures of the series race? Black bodies, male and female, are among the objects of the series race. Like female bodies, black bodies are not constituted simply by physical facts. Rather, they are constituted by rules created over time and that have changed over time. These rules and the ongoing actions instituting them have created practices, spaces, institutions, and environments where these rules are constantly reiterated, such as the barbershops for men and beauty parlors for women, the practices of strengthened hair, the practices of the afro hair, the the association between black bodies and athleticism, black neighborhoods, urban segregation, black churches, etc. As female bodies are created within the structures of enforced heterosexuality, black bodies, male and female, are given through rules governing the reproduction of black bodies and the sexual, familial, and intimate relationships between black persons and persons of other races. They have varied over time with the particular systems of domination at a time. They have created practices like the breaking of slave families, white masters' access to the bodies of black female slaves, forced sterilization of black American women, criminalization of mixed-race marriages, legally mandated contraception, etc. I want to suggest that there are at least two other structures that organize the social, practical, inert objects of the series of the black race. I'll call them the racial structure of labor and the racial structure of law, which interact in various ways. The racial structure of labor has to be understood in the historical context defined by slavery and its effects over time on the physical environment. It includes structures that relegate menial, low-skilled domestic labor to black persons, as well as to the structure of educational opportunities reflected in, among others, segregated school systems, affirmative action policies, and historically black colleges. So, yeah, labor. Okay, so this is attributing this sort of labor, the structure of labor, the history of labor in the United States as sort of a particular version or maybe subclass in sort of the social structure, maybe. Okay. This understanding of race enables inquiry into the connections between race and the structures that organize labor and the production of wealth in a capitalist economy with, for example, its low rewards for low-skilled work. You know, nowadays it's getting low-skilled is not maybe the wrong way of putting this. I think Ocasio-Cortez said it is like nobody in government could actually handle being a bartender in like Union Square like she could be. That'd be an incredibly demanding job. It's not low skilled at all. And nowadays with the pandemic, I mean, all these what were considered low skilled jobs all of a sudden became essential workers. And it's like, well, if it's so low skilled, but it can't also be essential. So this is a little bit granted the low rewards, but the low skilled is not. It's already part of the it's becoming not the right terminology, I guess, maybe. Anyway, I mean, the point is still valid, of course, that the jobs that black people have were just assumed to not be very well rewarded or very well valued. Oh well. Okay, continuing. And further enables an analysis of the connections between race and patterns of residential segregation, norms of work residential segregation, transportation policy, etc. Yep, the racial structure of law, too, has to be understood as the same effects over time of slavery and Jim Crow segregation. In the current context, mass incarceration of a disproportionately large black population and the growth of the prison system are parts of this structure. Excuse me. Parts of this structure. Understood in this way, as a series, the unity of race is constituted by the practical, inert reality of a complex, multi-layered, and interlocking constellation of objects and social practices and rules that structure them, and that our action is oriented towards. It is unity at the impersonal level. Thus understood, the unity of race brings together not only black Americans, but all Americans, because they all share the practical, inert reality of the series race as a common background to their actions, as is the basis of a solidarity across the racial divisions between black and white Americans. This way of understanding unity is also compatible with the diversity of black political life, for the diversity comes from the self-conscious groups can be created on the basis of the series. They will always be partial in relation to the series. Not all of these will be anti-racist. Like feminist groups, anti-racist groups are those who reference the realities of race as a series that, in some way, even implicitly, thematize it and attempt to change it. Different anti-racist groups will take on different parts of the complex reality of the series and, as a result, pursue different goals and aims and will use different means. However, all black groups will be united by the fact that they arise on the basis of the series race. All anti-racist groups will be further united by the fact that they reference the series of race. This unity of the social structure from which groups arise is a basis for solidarity. I call this form of solidarity racial structural solidarity, For individuals, it is solidarity in virtue of inhabiting the same social structure, of having the same social structure to orient our actions. For black groups, it is the solidarity in virtue of arising out of the same social reality. And for anti-racist groups, it is also a solidarity in virtue of referencing the same social reality, even if focusing on different parts of the complex realities of the series race. This solidarity across different political purposes, methods, strategies, and priorities. But it is not forged through political action, rather it is an expression of the social reality that gives rise to political action. Yeah, so we've got this social reality here. It's sort of social materiality almost. What is the material that we have to work with? And it's the social structures really. And that in some sense yields what a group political action. So in some sense, the raw material that the author here is trying to identify, the series, is this historical and structural, the received history in some sense that people have to deal with now, the concepts that we've been given. So what is that material and how do we reformulate it? Well, that is how it gives rise to political action, but we have to appreciate where things came from in some sense. So this is much more historically oriented, I feel. Whereas I think the Gooding-Williams was looking, people had an oppressor, and that's sort of what brought them together as individual trying to break off the tyranny. This is more of a distributed thing, the social reality. And so instead of a particular individual or a particular thing, such as the plantation owner, the tyrant, then this one is taking sort of a more distributed approach, looking at the history and the social reality as the material of what we have to work with here. Okay. Conclusion. I argued that questions of solidarity for collective action against racial oppression have to be preceded by social theoretical questions about the social reality that our collective action aims to change. Race as seriality, a concept I developed in analogy with Iris Young's gender as seriality, provides such a descriptive approach. I argued one that can ground a notion of solidarity on one's shared structure and personal situation. This provided an alternative to notions of solidarity based on one's identity, on one's experience, and with racial prejudice, as well as to notions of solidarity forged in action. Okay, and that's it. Yeah. So, see, these were on one's experience with racial prejudice, as well as no solid forged in action. Okay, yeah, again, so this is the question is, where is the source of solidarity of the group identity coming from? And so this is distributing it into the structure and material of the world, as opposed to, or the society, not world so much, as opposed to basing it more in the identity of a person and the personal sort of notions and the actions of the persons. All right. So that's interesting. If anyone has any questions, please ask it now. I don't have too much more to say. I do think this is a bit more, like I said, an Aristotelian take. You have to really take serious the material that you're given with that is forming up what counts the object, which is solidarity here, which is in question. So you have more of an Aristotelian analysis, or it looks to me that way. And that opposes the sort of individualistic formulations that the author has, basically how the author described Gooding-Williams and Shelby, which is a slightly different focus. Okay, but I guess if you're gonna deal with groups of people, it's very hard to organize people. Organization's incredibly difficult. So this is a nice paper in the sense that if it's right, which I don't know, I'm not. There is always a question of leadership. I am sometimes wondering what that counts as. So, but how do you actually understand what counts as like good leadership, and how do you form a group and get things done, get work done? Then in that sense, this is a good analysis, because it does take more seriously the received structures and goods that one has to work with, as opposed to the sort of more abstract things of the oppressor, or it's like this group action. That just is supposed to supposedly come together and work together. through deliberation, which is also good, but the deliberation itself does not take into account perhaps enough of the structure, I guess, is the criticism. Okay, so that's it for now. I guess I'll be back tomorrow. Yeah, I'll be back tomorrow with another paper tomorrow morning. Have a good night, folks, and stay safe. Please stay safe out there. Bye-bye.